ratio of government spending. So we've got work to do. We can do this, but we need to take the long vision, and we need to be very careful that we make the critical investments. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remaining of my time.
The gentleman yield back the balance of his time. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always an honor to come to this floor, these hallowed halls, and address the issues of the day. It's my colleague from across the aisle was discussing jobs. That is so important to most Americans. And there is one way we could do a great deal toward immediately putting Americans back to work, and that would be if we started utilizing more of our own energy resources, which with this nation has been so blessed. When you consider all of the natural resources that are natural energy sources, coal, natural gas, oil, we do have wind, places where solar works, but all of the carbon-based energy resources that are so valuable around the world, the ones for which we keep paying trillions of dollars to other nations that could be utilized here in the United States and could be utilized to create jobs right here at home, it does not make sense to keep sending hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars to countries that don't like us. We're doing that through the purchase of energy. I've listened to all the explanations about why we've gone into Libya that have been made in the press, those press conferences, all kinds of releases by this administration, and you still come back to trying to figure out why Libya was so much more important than Tunisia or so many of the other, Iran. I mean, the people of Iran have attempted rebellions against madman Ahmadinejad, and this administration didn't seem to lend a helping hand. And that's a nation whose leaders have sworn to see that the United States, as Ahmadinejad said, will soon no longer be a nation. As Ahmadinejad had said, we'll soon be able to experience a world without the United States and Zionism. So he's saying we're going to eliminate the United States, we're going to eliminate Israel. That ought to cause concern. Have we lifted anything other than trying to prevent people from buying goods from Iran? No, really. Oh, yes, and those sanctions are going to work, and probably in another 15, 20 years, they've got a real chance of working. The trouble is, in 15 or 20 years, and actually the possibility exists in a whole lot less than 5, if we continue to persist in sanctions and nothing more with Iran, they'll get nuclear weapons, and then they will give us a choice: either remove the sanctions or count on a nuclear blast coming in your country. That's why we have to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons. They will use them, and they will certainly threaten to use them so that they can get what they want. In fact, they may get more by threatening the use once they have them than they would to actually use them. But as Ahmadinejad has made clear in a number of settings, he expects the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, to be coming, and he believes he can hasten the return of the Mahdi, have a global caliphate where all of us fall on our knees, supposedly, or die. Well, we could prevent that. Could have stopped it long before now, but we haven't. So what makes Libya so special? It's really interesting, and it's hard to put our finger on it. Libya does produce oil. China, as I understand, may be the biggest purchaser of Libyan oil, but not the United States. So why should we go rushing to spend hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in Libya? Europe, England are big customers of Libyan oil. So why would we be running to help Europe and England with their Libyan oil? Well, the President's made clear it's because they asked us to. You know, we've got a number, and Secretary Clinton has also said he's made the rounds of the news programs. The Arab states asked us to, the UN asked us to, Europe and England has asked us to, so why would we ever need to come to Congress? It's been made very clear, you know. The public has heard those comments. You don't have to come to Congress when the UN has said it's something that needs to be done. It's interesting, though. I don't recall any of the cabinet members or the President raising their right hand and taking an oath to defend the United Nations. I was thinking their oath had to do with our Constitution and our country, and it's also been made clear that Libya was not a threat to our national security, not a threat to our vital interests, yet we're willing to put our treasure and our American lives on the line for something that's not in our vital interests. That does not make sense. But then again, as you continue to piece together the Obama doctrine, we get it that apparently intervening, risking American lives and spending American treasure that this administration didn't earn, but they're taking away from taxpayers and then borrowing from others, that's okay if it kind of feels like it ought to be something we do, you know? If it feels like we ought to go to Libya and risk American lives and spend all that American treasure, then let's go. Because after all, people asked us to do that. Why would we not go when people around the world ask us to do that? Could it possibly be that a reason for not doing it is because an oath was taken to this country, not to the UN, not to the Chinese or the European constitutions or the European Union, but to this country? This is where the oath was taken. These are the people in America for whom and to whom the oath was made. But then we look at the energy again, and we look at spending treasure, and as more people are finding out, in the last couple of years, this administration has said, you know what, we're shutting down drilling in the Gulf Coast. We're not just going to stop the one country that had around 800 safety violations while others had 1 or 2 during the same period. Because, you know, see, that's British Petroleum, and British Petroleum, as we found out, was poised to come public and be the administration and the Democratic Party's one big energy company that rode in on a white horse and said, we support the cap-and-trade bill. We're going to make money like crazy for BP on the side, trading in carbon. These stupid Americans, they don't get it. It's a transfer of wealth like nothing anybody's ever seen before. American people lose. Companies like BP and General Electric, they'll all win big. but the American people lose. But they wouldn't go after BP, and it took so long to go after them. And when you know that BP was going to be their big energy company to embrace and endorse the cap-and-trade bill, then it makes a lot more sense as to why it took the administration so long to respond. And then, of course, we called the president, sat down with BP exec and said, okay, let's tell the American public you're going to put up $20 billion. They did. Well, that salved some feelings, but there was never $20 billion put up. And so isn't it amazing? We don't know what all was discussed. We don't know what all quid pro quo was promised for BP coming in and offering large sums of money. Obviously, there were a lot of people on the coast that were devastated and continue to be devastated who were not compensated by any money from BP. But nonetheless, it took the heat off of BP for a while. So perhaps the administration thought that after having the moratorium and putting tens of thousands of families out of work, putting tens and thousands of families onto unemployment insurance, devastating tens of thousands of families, perhaps the administration thought nobody would notice that the first permit that was extended after this moratorium to hurt the southern states, actually hurt the whole country, but the first permit went to, I believe it was Noble Energy Company, but the major investor was a company called British Petroleum. Now, was that a quid pro quo from, okay, BP, we're not going to be able to take you out in the Rose Garden, have you announce you support the cap-and-trade bill because, you know, you're just not well thought of right now, it wouldn't work right now, but there'll be pie in the sky by and by if you will just play along with us for a while. Who knows what conversation occurred there, but isn't it interesting that BP was the largest investor in the drilling that got the first permit after the moratorium. Now, to understand, there haven't been just a glut of permits come rushing forward. There are still tens of thousands of families that were made destitute by this administration because they chose to punish the entire South and even the country rather than allowing energy jobs to go forward in the Gulf Coast area. So imagine the surprise of some of those destitute folks that have just been traumatized by this administration when they find out that our president has just been down in South America telling the Brazilians that we think so much of their drilling and we're going to loan them $2 billion to drill off their coast, and that when they strike this oil off their coast, the president tells them, we're going to be your best customer. Why couldn't we be our own best customer? Why couldn't we be drilling off our own coast? Why couldn't we be drilling in Anwar? Why couldn't we be drilling in the North Slope area where there's no drilling allowed yet? We would be our own best customer. We would create millions of jobs, not just in the oil industry, but all kinds of jobs, if the president were not wanting to punish this area. I mean, it's just as if we're wanting to punish free enterprise. And we find out that actually we've had a very cold winter where I live, and yet the EPA under this administration doesn't care. And they don't care that the new regulations they're coming out with would not have maybe 1/10000000th of 1% effect on the CO2 level in the atmosphere. 1/10000000th of 1% of the CO2 in the atmosphere. And yet, as a result of this administration and their war against jobs, the war on jobs, you got the EPA out there trying to put people out of business, keeping people from hiring, when the truth is those jobs leave here, they go to South America, they go to China, India, different places, and they pollute a minimum of 4 times more than the pollution in this country from the same industry, because we do a good job of policing industries. And when the economy is going well, that is when you have the best chance of really cleaning the environment, because when an economy is struggling, and China knows about struggling economy, trying to employ people to keep them from getting upset and revolting, when an economy is struggling, people don't care so much about the environment. They're more interested in just feeding themselves, having a roof over their heads, and surviving. So you want to help the environment. If that is the true purpose, then what you do is allow the economy to thrive. And this president's had a war on jobs, and that continues. Oh, I'm sorry, I should qualify that. A war on jobs in America. Because obviously we're helping create jobs in Brazil. We're helping the Democratic largest contributor, Mr. Soros, with his single largest investment in the drilling down in South America or Brazil. So the Democrats' largest investor is going to make a tremendous amount of money because we're loaning $2 billion to pay him and his investment up there, or down there rather, to do the drilling that we won't allow in this country. Why is it that our global president is more interested in creating jobs in Brazil than in the United States? I guess whenever we find out that reason, it may help us understand why we expend American treasure and risk American lives in a country that is of no vital interest to this country. And it is interesting when you look at the history of Muammar Gaddafi. This is not a nice man. This is not a man that should have avoided prison and perhaps even capital punishment, depending on charges and the evidence being proved or proving the charges. Yet you have to look at what will replace Gaddafi when he's gone. Now, first we hear from the administration, no, there's no al-Qaeda, they're rebelling. And then we find out, yes, there is. They're involved. The Muslim Brotherhood is involved in the rebellion in Egypt. Now, Mubarak was a dictator. We're not big fans of dictatorship in this country. But when you have to look at the national vital interests here, and you have a man who is in charge in Egypt, who is not a threat to the United States, and was living as best one could with the status quo next to Israel, and yet there is an effort to throw Mubarak out of office, and any kind of decent intel would indicate you got the Muslim Brotherhood that in all likelihood will replace Mubarak. Then why do we call for Mubarak to leave and allow himself to be replaced by a group that wants us all to bow the knee in one giant global caliphate to religion, when some of us believe in our own, my case, Christian beliefs, heart and soul, which I had hoped to get through this life without having to die for. But there are people who are trying to take over Egypt, who we've given great encouragement to. There are people in Libya. They're wanting to take over that country and its powerful military. who would like us to either convert from Christianity or to lose our heads. Why would we be helping them? That's a difficult question. So if it weren't so serious, it would be an amusing game to try to figure out what this administration is attempting to do. What is the Obama doctrine? When it comes to the budget, the President gave a wonderful speech. He read it impeccably well about how we have got to cut spending. He gave that speech right before he released his budget. And that budget was projecting around a $3.75 trillion expenditure when we were only going to take in around $2.1 trillion. So he gave a speech about cutting spending, and he's been doing that the last 2 years. And it turns out the first year we had a $1 trillion deficit. The next year we had more than that. And this year the President's proposed a budget and spending that will be a $1.65 trillion deficit. That makes no sense. Why would you give speeches saying you're going to cut spending, and yet every year it goes up and up dramatically? That doesn't make sense. And yet, we know the results of the election in November indicated very clearly the American people want the spending cut. We can't continue to live in a country that is running up trillion-dollar deficits. People will quit buying our bonds. We're dangerously close to having our bonds downgraded, our rating lowered, and if that happens, interest rates go up. And if the interest rates go up like that, that'll give fodder to those who are demanding that something besides the dollar be used to buy oil. I mean, it could put this country in a terrible financial spiral downward from which it might be impossible to pull out. I was in a plane once when I was told the baffles were taken out. It was aerobatically qualified, and I was being allowed to sit in the co-pilot's seat. It was a crop dusting plane, and it was kind of fun flying the plane with the joystick. And I said through the radio system in the plane to the pilot, this thing is acrobatic qualified, isn't it? You know, we could do loops, going in and out of spins. And he said it would be, but we removed the baffles from inside the wings where the gasoline is, the fuel is stored. So if we go into a spin, then the fuel all runs to one end of one wing, and we go into a spin we can't get out of, and we'll crash and both of us die. Well, that's kind of where we're headed with this thing. If we don't get the spending under control, one thing leads to another, and we're in big trouble, and it's got to stop. And at the same time, we're supposed to be helping Americans with better health care. If you liked your insurance, you were going to keep it, and yet we found out that absolutely was not true. If you liked your doctor, you can keep him. We found out that absolutely was not true. It's a bad bill. And then when you find out that the prior Congress not only passed that 2,800-page bill, all kinds of things in it, including a new President's Commissioned Officer Corps and Non-Commissioned Officer Corps. Do we really need that? I wondered when I'd read that in the bill. But then when you find out we're being sent to Libya and going to use our treasure and our American lives there, maybe there's intention to so deplete the military that we're going to need that Presidential Reserve Officer, Commissioned Corps, and Non-Commissioned Corps that the President can call up on a moment's notice involuntarily, according to the Obamacare bill. But the trouble is, there's already been $105 billion appropriated. It's like writing post-dated checks. that are due to be cashed each year into the future. Well, you're really not supposed to do that. That's not appropriate. This isn't like Social Security where it is controlled by formulas and it's in automatic motion. This was just an appropriation. It's not mandatory. It can be repealed, but to do so, it actually has to be rescinded. My friend Steve King has got a bill that would prohibit any money that's currently been appropriated through the President from being utilized for the purposes. In other words, it ties the hands of the administration from using any of the money already appropriated for the purposes of implementing this Obamacare program. Denny Rayburg has an amendment that was voted in that also has some effect in that regard. Jack Kingston is an appropriator and has come up with an idea that a couple of us have joined forces with him, and I think we've got around 22 co-sponsors, and that's growing constantly. But this is an approach that I would hope would attract Democrats in both the Senate and the House, because it is an important principle. And I would certainly hope that it would attract Democrats in the House, because it in effect says we're not going to do post-dated checks for something besides Social Security, those type of things that are controlled by formulas. We're going to cancel the post-dated checks. Now, it should be attractive to my friends in the minority now, because someday they may be back in the majority. And if and when that happens, they surely would not want the Republican majority to have passed a decade worth of spending bills, not for Social Security, not for mandatory spending, but a decade worth of spending with post-dated checks, say you can't ever stop this. So the principle that the Kingston bill would stand on is that these type of things must be taken up annually. So we're going to cancel all the post-dated checks that were going to be cashed in the future, and if the Democratic representatives get back in the majority, some will say it's not a good idea, because if they get back in the majority, they can just appropriate that money. Well, of course they can. They could pass a whole different health care bill if they get back in the majority. That's the way it works. When you're in the majority, you can pass things. So it would not be unfair to just say we're canceling all those post-dated checks. We're canceling $105 billion worth of spending. And if you get back in the majority, it's up to you what you appropriate, but as long as we're in the majority, we're not spending that money. That allows us to keep our promise. It allows people on both sides of the aisle to say we're standing on principle and on procedure, that the majority should rule in the legislature and not a minority that years ago was a majority. That's a better way to do it. So there have been those questions. Some have said, why make it so complicated? In the new bill that we have proposed today, filed today, it would effectively end the $105.5 billion in the funding that was in Obamacare by turning them into an authorization without the appropriation. That means not this or any future administration would be able to spend the money without first coming to Congress and getting majority here in both the House and the Senate to approve it. Now, there are those that say, well, there were a few good things in that Obamacare bill. Well, my gosh, when you have a 2,800-page bill, there surely ought to be something in there that is decent. And there were a few good things. But why not make those, a 25-page bill instead of a 2,800-page bill? Why create all these hundreds of new agencies, the hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations, all those things that come from this massive government overload. Why not just do away with all of those things? That's what we should do. And then start, as not President Obama, but Senator Obama had said we should do when he said repeatedly we ought to have negotiations on a health care bill. We ought to have hearings. We ought to have negotiations that are public. Have them on C-SPAN, if C-SPAN will carry it. Let everyone see who's in it for themselves and who's in it for the American people. And I think the American people, even without seeing the negotiations on Obamacare, they got the message who was for the American people, and that's why the House changed hands. So we hope that in the next few days there will be more and more people get on board, because this is an important principle. A minority, even though they once were a majority, should not be able to bind future Congresses on things that are not mandatory through formulas like Social Security. Now, with regard to Libya, there were some interesting quotes from the President's speech. He had pointed out that Gaddafi had denied his people freedom, exploited their wealth, murdered opponents at home and abroad, terrorized innocent people. This has been going on for years. It's certainly been going on all the time that President Obama has been in office. It was going on when he was a senator, and he'd never called on these kind of things before. But he goes on, and just 2 paragraphs down, he says, joining with other nations at the United Nations Security Council, we broadened our sanctions, imposed an arms embargo, enabled Gaddafi and those around him to be held accountable for their crimes. Now, I'm familiar with holding people accountable for their crimes. As a former judge, as a former prosecutor, I've done that, hold people accountable for their crimes. I don't see what this administration has done to make Gaddafi accountable for his crimes. In fact, there's discussion in the news today that this administration is floating the idea of some type of amnesty if Gaddafi will just leave. So that may be, that statement in his speech may be like the one, like if you like your health insurance, you'll be able to keep it. It sounds good, but it has no basis in fact. But the President said military jets and helicopter gunships were unleashed upon people who had no means to defend themselves against assault from the air. My understanding is that's happened in Burma, Pakistan, possibly in Syria. There are a lot of other countries it's happened in where we haven't gone against the administration in that country. So that was a little puzzling. And the President said after 9 days ago, after consulting the bipartisan leadership in Congress, I authorized military action to stop the killing and enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1973. But the fact is, we've been told repeatedly that this administration had the support of the UN, to whom the President did not take an oath to defend, and did not have the consent of the governed in this country, not the governed and not the governed's legally elected representatives. Now, the President said in his speech, we hit Gaddafi's troops. Well, I would think with the President's broad education, he would understand if an infidel or an infidel country like we're considered kills Muslims, then we're worthy of death under what they consider the law. So if the President's right and we haven't just shot rockets and taken out certain type of military hardware. We've actually killed Muslims in Libya, then we have not made ourselves a bunch of friends, and in fact that may be one of the reasons we see the President's image being stomped on and burned and destroyed in effigy in Libya and foreign countries. The President says, I said Americans' role would be limited. We would not put ground troops into Libya, that we would focus our unique capabilities on the front end of the operation, and we would transfer responsibility to our allies and partners. In other words, we're turning over command, but our U.S. military is doing the lion's share of the fighting. And so we keep hearing that in the news. This administration is turning over the lion's share of the effort when actually they're turning over the leadership. But my office has made an official request yesterday for the administration to know what percentage of the military of NATO is U.S. military, and we were given the figure 65%. So it doesn't come as a great comfort to many of us that we're turning over this great responsibility that we have led as helpers in Libya to NATO when we're 65% of NATO. That's one of those things that sounds good, kind of like if you like your insurance, you can keep it, but it really doesn't have much basis in fact for comfort. The President said in his speech, NATO has taken command of the enforcement of the arms embargo and no-fly zone. And yet it's confusing because those speaking for the administration here in Washington seem to indicate that we have not yet turned over command. He says, going forward, the lead in enforcing the no-fly zone and protecting civilians on the ground will transition to our allies and our partners. I guess that means NATO, which we're 65% of. I know I look stupid sometimes, but, I mean, I can get that. If we're turning it over to a group that's 65% us, we really hadn't turned it over unless we want to say, yeah, but we're not leading anymore. We're putting our military under the command of foreigners who've never taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of this country. How do you feel good about that? Well, it's hard for some of us to feel good about it. The President says Libya will remain dangerous. The question is, dangerous to whom? We saw that after invasion of Iraq, that Gaddafi threw up his hands and said, hey, we'll give up nukes, we'll give up pursuing anything. We don't want you to invade our country, so we want to work with you. We saw a similar attitude after President Reagan dropped a bomb down his chimney. So we know that as long as Gaddafi knows we have a strong president who will go after him if he does anything to us, then we have nothing to fear. But we also know from his history, if he is not controlled, if we do not have a strong president who is willing to go after and punish those who are attempting to destroy us, then maybe he is dangerous. Maybe that's what the President was talking about in his speech. Anyway, the President said we also had the ability to stop Gaddafi's forces in their tracks without putting American troops on the ground. But here again, it didn't have the support of the American people, it didn't have support of Congress. And it brings back to mind when George W. Bush was president, he enjoyed playing golf. He still does, apparently. Never played with him, but I understand he's a good athlete. But once troops were committed to harm's way, President George W. Bush said it didn't feel right for him to be out on a golf course while troops he committed to harm's way were in danger. So he gave up playing golf for the rest of his administration. Yet the current administration has a president at the top who not only doesn't feel any qualms about playing golf while we have troops that he committed to harm's way, he'll also play golf and pause long enough to commit more troops to harm's way. The President said the democratic impulses that are dawning across the region would be eclipsed by the darkest form of dictatorship. That's unfortunately what the majority of Americans are concerned about happening here in America if we get away from the legislative process and forcing bills through that are not supported by the American public and forcing American commitments in places that America does not support and spending beyond anything a drunken sailor would have ever spent. We're afraid of what's happening in this country. We're afraid of what's happening to our economy. And the President said it's also what the Libyan opposition asks us to do. Well, then we find out the Libyan opposition is composed of at least numerous members who are part of al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. And apparently al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood representatives had not asked us to intervene militarily in Egypt or Tunisia or Syria, and maybe that's the difference. I don't know, but it's disconcerting. The fact is, when you look at the oath we took, our allegiance is to this country. It's not to the United Nations. It's not to other countries. It's to this nation. So a serious look at Libya and the problems there might deserve some intervention, but first we have to ask the question, is whomever will replace Gaddafi more of a danger to this country than Gaddafi? If the answer is possibly yes, then we should not be sending American treasure and American lives to help intervene on behalf of people who would like to see this nation destroyed. That ought to be pretty common sense. One other factor is Israel. We have a true friend in Israel in the Middle East. But unfortunately, our friends have seen the way we've treated our best friend in the Middle East, Israel. We vote against them at times, like we did last May. We snub them in public ways. People hear about, or Israel's enemies hear about how we've snubbed Israel. And Israel's enemies know when there is a crack, and especially a perceived, whether it's there or not, a perceived distance between Israel and their greatest ally that used to be us, then it's time to move. That's when the flotilla came last May, is after we voted against Israel. That's when a lot of these actions began taking place. People who want to see Israel gone seem to be in the middle of revolting in a number of countries around the Middle East and Africa. We got to come back to what's best for the United States, and it should be very clear with the common interests and beliefs that the people of Israel have in the value of life and the value of equality of people and the equality of women. Those ought to be our friends. Those ought to be people who, when under attack, tell us we're next. And in this case, it's not a hard deduction to get to, because the people have said, we want to eliminate Israel, the little Satan, and then the United States, the big Satan. So Israel is a great investment as a defense partner, because if they go down, we're certainly next. And I also happen to believe that by blessing Israel, we can be blessed. Before I conclude my time here tonight, it is so important to take a look historically at things that have been said in the past history of this nation, that have been said in this building in official settings, that have been said by those who have led the way, carried a torch to light our way down the years. One such man was the chaplain of the Senate, Peter Marshall. I was given this book in the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, Sermons and Prayers of Peter Marshall while he was chaplain of the United States Senate. So I'd just like to read a prayer that Peter Marshall gave in the Senate for the historical value and the insight of this brilliant man, dedicated Christian. He said, "Our Father, we are beginning to understand at last that the things that are wrong with our world are the sum total of all the things that are wrong with us as individuals. Thou hast made us after thine image, and our hearts can find no rest until they rest in thee. We are too Christian, really, to enjoy sinning, and too fond of sinning to really enjoy Christianity. Most of us know perfectly well what we ought to do. Our trouble is that we do not want to do it. Thy help is our only hope. Make us want to do what is right, and give us the ability to do it. In the name of Christ our Lord, amen." Prayer of Peter Marshall. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Jackson, is recognized for 30 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've recently given several special order speeches about my view of the Constitution and making my argument for why I think it should be amended to include certain basic rights that the American people currently lack, such as the right to a high-quality education, the right to health care, and equal rights for women. I believe these rights should be given to the American people as a matter of moral and social justice. However, more than that, I believe that there is a strong economic case for why these rights should be granted by this Congress. If we guarantee the right to an education of equal high quality to every American and give the Congress the power to implement that right by appropriate legislation, then, Mr. Speaker, we will set off a true race to the top as states, cities, and the federal government are compelled to meet a new standard. The nature of the problem. In 50 states, there are 95,000 schools. There are 15,000 school districts, 3,141 counties, 19,000 municipal governments, and 30,000 incorporated cities. And in all of that government, there are 60 million children who are being asked to be the very best that they can be. With my amendment, that means more teachers and teachers' aides and tutors for our kids. It means that construction companies and roofers and architects will be engaged to build new schools and improve old ones. It means technology companies benefit as computers and laptops are purchased, and yes, iPads, Kindles, and Nooks replace textbooks. I realize that there will be a cost to all of this, but I believe that if we can find the resources for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and military action in Libya, then we can find the resources to educate our children and the American people. Most importantly, for 308 million Americans, we can't afford not to. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to put my proposals tonight in some historical context if I can. I want to suggest that through the course of human history, law is actually going somewhere. I want to suggest that at points in time from the earliest civilizations, progress has been made incrementally towards freedom, towards justice, and towards human rights. I want to put our own Constitution and the Bill of Rights into the context at vital points in time. These documents are not the end of all and the be-all of democracy and freedom. No, Mr. Speaker, the very ability to amend our Constitution suggests that the founders of our country see things the way I do, that the document they crafted as a landmark in human history, but not perfect. It's not a final draft. So tonight, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a walk through history to talk a little bit about where law and human rights have been, where they are, and where they're going. And a couple of themes are going to emerge, that as history shows that law is heading in a certain direction, we're going to see an action by a majority in this Congress heading in the opposite direction of human law through human history. Like all civilization, the roots of democracy and human rights lie in what is known as the Middle East, the Mesopotamian Empire. Although those early civilizations were not decidedly not democratic and not inclusive of human rights, the evolution of law as we know it started there. Around 2350 BC, before Christ, Mesopotamia was ruled by Uruk-Kingina, the Uruk-Kingina Code, the oldest known set of laws. They are referenced in documents from the period as the consolidation of, and I quote, ordinances that claim that kings were appointed by gods and affirmed the rights of citizens to know why certain actions were being punished. Some 300 years later, around 2050 BC, Ununrama's code was the earliest known written law. Forgive my pronunciation. Only a handful of articles can be deciphered, but evidence suggests an advanced legal system with specialized judges, testimony under oath, and the ability for judges to assess damages to be paid to victims by the guilty party. In 1850 BC, we saw the first law known legal decision involving the murder of a temple employee by 3 other men. 9 witnesses testified against them, and 3 were sentenced to death. In 1700 BC, Hammurabi's code was carved into rock columns in Babylon. The underlying principle was, and I quote, an eye for an eye, unquote. Some 282 clauses regulated an array of obligations, professions, and rights, including commerce, slavery, marriage, theft, and debts. Punishment by modern standards was barbaric, including cutting off hands or fingers as a punishment for theft. In 1300 BC, the Jewish Torah and the Christian Old Testament say that the 10 Commandments were received by Moses directly from God. Contained in the book of Exodus, those commandments became the basis of modern laws against murder, adultery, and stealing. Around 1280 BC in India, rules passed down orally through generations were formally written down as the laws of Manu. They were the basis of India's caste system, and punishment was used sparingly and only as a last resort. Interestingly, members of the higher castes were punished more severely than those in the lower castes. In 621 BC, Draco's law was written for the Athenians. The punishment in this code was so severe, often death, that we derived the word draconian from it. However, Draco's law introduced the concept that the state, not private parties or vigilantes, had the exclusive role in trying and punishing a person for a crime. Shortly after Draco's law, the Spartan king Lycurgus gave his oral law to the world. Lycurgus's law held that women had a duty to have children, but if the children were deformed, they would be killed. Those who lived became wards of Sparta at age 7 when they began preparation for military duty. In 550 BC, Solon, an Athenian statesman and lawmaker, redefined and refined Draco's law by, quote, democratizing it, making it more accessible to the citizens of Athens. Around the same time, in 536 BC, China created the Book of Punishments, which limited the ways in which somebody could be punished after being convicted of a very serious crime, but still allowed for tattooing, manipulation, the amputation of feet, and death as legal punishments. In 450 BC, the 12 Tables in Rome were created. These form the basis of all modern law. Under these laws, a system of public justice was developed whereby injured parties could seek compensation from guilty defendants. The lower classes, the plebes, were given greater protection from abuses by the ruling classes, the patricians, especially with regard to debts. The 12 Tables also prohibited marriages between classes, severely punished death, and gave fathers the right of life or death over their sons. The tables survived for nearly 1,000 years until they were destroyed by the invading Gauls in 390 AD. 100 years later, in 350 BC, the first Chinese imperial code of laws, the Code of Lickitve, dealt with the issues of theft, robbery, arrest, and other general subjects. It served as a model for the Chinese Tang Code, which came about 1,000 years later. In 339 BC, the trial of Socrates played a role in the development of law. Accused of corrupting the minds of youth with his logic and of not believing in the gods, Socrates was a scapegoat for the loss of the Peloponnesian Wars. He was sentenced to death by a vote of 361 to 140, but his trial advanced the idea of the role of consciousness and conscience in legal proceedings. Socrates was afforded the opportunity to speak to the jury and engage them in a dialogue, and instead he chose to give the jury a speech criticizing them for their lack of sensitivity. While it may not be contemplated as part of the traditional legal history, the life of Jesus Christ informs my personal understanding of the law. Under Jesus' law, pure motives, a mature love, and grace unmerited, as well as nominal justice, good behavior, and honorable ends became important. Jesus was not replacing Moses' law, but was seen as fulfilling and perfecting it. In the book of Matthew, Jesus says, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." In Galatians, Paul writes, "For the whole law of Moses is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And in Romans he writes, "Love is fulfilling the law." Thus, this Judeo-Christian understanding of the law is both a commitment to justice, and the application of a knowledgeable understanding of love is important to the spiritual framework that underlies and undergirds much of my understanding and this nation's philosophy towards the law, as well as the purpose and function of the law in society. All law, after the birth and resurrection of Jesus Christ, is profoundly impacted. We make a transition from before Christ to Anno Domini. Jumping ahead to 529 Anno Domini, Justinian's code organized Roman law into a series of books called Corpus Juris Civilis. This legal collection was guided by Greek and English common law, the two main influences on contemporary Western jurisprudence. Many legal principles in use today, including the very spelling of the modern word justice, emanate from Justinian, the emperor of the Byzantium. The 17-article Constitution of Japan, written in 604 AD, shaped the country's morality and law. Paternalistic in orientation, it espoused such legalisms as peace and harmony, that they should be respected because they are important for intergroup relations, and equality, speediness, and integrity should be maintained in court procedures. One distinction that characterized two different legal traditions is that much of the traditional Asian law seeks to prevent disputes, whereas Western law seeks to resolve disputes. Very important, Mr. Speaker. A distinction between Asian law is that it seeks to prevent disputes, whereas Western law seeks to resolve disputes. In 653 AD, the kingdoms that make up modern-day China were consolidated, and the Tang Code, revising earlier existing Chinese laws and standardized procedures, was created. It listed crimes and their punishments in 501 articles, and one of those allowed just two forms of capital punishment for a convicted criminal: beheading or hanging. Shortly thereafter, in 700 AD, China invented the use of fingerprinting as a means of identifying people. In 1100 AD, the first law school came into existence. The basis of English common law, in 1215 AD, the Magna Carta was signed by King John. It forced the king for the first time to concede a number of rights to the barons and to the people. Its 61 clauses included freedom of church, fair taxation, control over imprisonments, habeas corpus, and the right of all merchants to come and go freely except in time of war. Its most important clause was number 39, stating that no free man shall be captured or imprisoned except by the judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Now, even the king was restrained from merely exercising his will against another person. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights was enacted, the precursor to our American Bill of Rights. It prohibited the arbitrary suspension of parliamentary laws and, more importantly, limited Parliament to the right to raise money through taxation. In 1692, the Salem witch trials captivated Salem, Massachusetts. The fervor resulted in more than 300 accusations of witchcraft, with 23 executions as a result. It thrust the justice system into the popular mind in a way never seen before. In 1740, the infamous South Carolina Slave Code, which regulated the use of slaves, became the model for slavery in other states. It said that all Negroes, Indians, and their offspring shall be and are hereby declared to be and remain forever hereafter slaves, and shall be deemed to be chattels personal in the hands of their owners. And then in 1765, law became more accessible to the common man when a British barrister named Blackstone broke down the entire English law system in an easy-to-read 4-volume Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. Blackstone's work was easily exported to the new British colonies and was the basis for the governments, according to many legal scholars. In 1792, the Somerset case captured the world's attention. James Somerset, a slave in Massachusetts, escaped from his master while on a trip abroad in England. He was recaptured and imprisoned to be sent to Jamaica, then a British colony. But 3 English citizens claimed to be his godparents. 3 white citizens claimed to be the godparents of an African-American slave, and they filed a suit, alleging that slavery was not legal under British law. They won their case. Somerset was freed, and slavery was finished in Great Britain. The reaction in the colonies was profound. Partly in response to the Somerset case, the colonies in America revolted. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence by the American colonists from Great Britain created a new day for human rights. It asserted that all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. But we know that the writers of the Declaration did not intend those words to apply to all men, certainly not to women or the American slave. The Constitution of the United States of America was signed in Philadelphia in September of 1787 and ratified by 9 states on June 21, 1788. It formed the legal basis for the first republican form of government in the history of the world. It defined the institutions of government and the powers of the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branches. Its shortcomings with respect to slavery, along with power struggles between the federal government and the states, are well documented. Nevertheless, the Constitution and its inherent ability to be amended have been the model for many other nations in attaining their independence and represent one of the most important steps in the development of law and human rights. The American Bill of Rights, the first of 10 amendments to the Constitution, was approved and ratified in 1791. These 10 amendments, in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson, declared rights in the areas of free speech, free press, free religion, the right to trial by jury, protection against cruel and unusual punishment, and unreasonable searches and seizures. The Bill of Rights has influenced many modern charters and bills of rights around the world and stands alone as one of the bedrocks of not just our democracy, but of human rights history. In 1803, in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court upheld the supremacy of the Constitution and stated unequivocally that the court had the power to strike down actions taken by American states and federal bodies that in its judgment were unconstitutional. This principle of judicial review represents, in my opinion, and the opinion of many legal scholars, the biggest advance in American law since the Constitution was ratified. It serves as a model for the balance of powers that many other nations have adopted. 1 year after Marbury, France adopted the Napoleonic Code, which canonized many of the victories of the French Revolution, including individual liberty, equality before the law, and the consent of the governed, character of the state. It had great influence beyond France, with Quebec, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, California, Louisiana, and Louisiana adopting parts of it. The Geneva Convention of 1864 set forth basic human rights standards during times of war, including protection of military medical personnel and humane treatment for the wounded. It was later supplemented by a prisoner of war convention. Though it has been violated and ignored numerous occasions, the Geneva Convention remains an important legal document and a milestone on the march of law and human rights. In 1865, following the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passed and the states ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, officially ending legal slavery. Prior to that, the 10th Amendment was the turning point in the Constitution of the United States. Those rights not written in the Constitution are in the purview of the states. The addition of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution established a new paradigm. If slavery, as conservatives and Southerners argued, is a state right, then states' rights can never be human rights. The Constitution, with the addition of the 13th Amendment, changed the present order and it divided time. I'm in Congress today, and Barack Obama is President of the United States because of the Constitution and its capacity to change time and space. In 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which put forth a legal code of internationally recognized human rights. It serves as a basic guide to the fundamental rights of all people. Since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we've seen many, many more landmarks in human rights that have been reached. We're even watching the Middle East now seek even greater human rights against monarchies and kings and other leaders who are despots and not believing in the basic rights of people. And while we've failed to ensure full equality for all women in this country, we're making progress towards pay equality. I believe we need to amend the Constitution to ensure that women have fully equal standing with men. We've enacted hate crimes legislation, and many states have moved towards marriage equality for gays and lesbians. We've much more work to do on that front. And as I began my remarks tonight, I began, Mr. Speaker, by saying that we need to amend our Constitution to include certain rights that the American people should have but don't. As I just said, we need to include the right, equal rights for women. We need to include the right to a public education of equal high quality. We need to include health care as a right for all Americans. Mr. Speaker, it might surprise some Americans to know, which we learned in Bush v. Gore, that we don't even have a fundamental right to vote in the U.S. Constitution, only a right to not be discriminated against in the states while voting. So from the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia, the development of Europe, Asia, North America, and the rest of the modern world, we've seen greater democracy. We've seen more inclusion. We've seen more freedom. We've gone from vigilante justice to an eye for an eye, that is, an eye for an eye, to the modern criminal justice system. The death penalty was a common response to crime in many of the earliest civilizations, and it persists to this day in many places around the world, including here in the United States. But my home state of Illinois, thanks to Governor Pat Quinn, recently banned the death penalty. I personally support that, but I know many of my colleagues would not. There's an element in this Congress that's heading in the opposite direction of human law in human history. But the arc of history continues. The development of human rights did not stop with the writing of our Constitution, and it did not stop with the writing of our Bill of Rights. The Constitution is not static. It is not set in stone. Take it as it is, and take it as it is an only document. It, like the overall development of human rights and the law through time, is organic. It's dynamic. It's living. It's forward-looking. It is adaptable to the changes of the new day and the new world. In fact, in their infinite wisdom, the framers of the Constitution set up the very mechanisms by which the march of justice and human rights could continue, an amendment process. It's not an easy one, and it's not one that should be taken lightly. But I believe we should indeed revisit our sacred document and amend it to include fundamental freedoms for the American people. Thus, human law and political rights have evolved through history to ever higher forms of granting more rights. This has also meant the responsibilities and obligations have moved away from external sources and appointed government power to the voice of the majority of the democratically elected representatives of the people. The word democracy is comprised of two Greek words, demos and kratos, people, strength, or power, people power. It means we the people have the strength and the power in the end to elect people to make our laws and rules. We the people have the right to declare what rights we have and what rights we don't have, what rules we will live and play by, and under which laws we will be governed. A representative democratic government is a political structure and arrangement whereby the supreme governmental authority is accepted and the rules are made with the consent of the majority of the common people. Thus, the contrast between organic, evolutionary, and political nature of the law versus the static, strict constructionist, natural view of the law should be clear in terms of the creation and preservation of political rights in human development. The approach of conservatives to play down or advocate an anti-political, anti-legislative, anti-federal government philosophy of social change is therefore certainly not a strategy designed to advance the public interests or real economic interests of a majority of the American people. These conservatives and Tea Party activists who will descend upon Washington tomorrow are acting on behalf of the special interests of the few who do not want mass democratic participation in action. This anti-democratic and undemocratic conservative approach is a strategy to undermine progressive and economic change intended to benefit the public good. In a living democracy, we must continually criticize and reform our politics, our government and policies to keep them relevant, effective, efficient, accessible, accountable, and responsible to real people's needs. This is very different, however, from criticizing politics and the government per se as irrelevant and ineffective as instruments of change, of protecting old rights as opposed to advancing new ones. It is quite clear that the strict constructionist constitutional approach of conservatives like Mr. Quayle and Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Robertson and Mr. Meese, Mr. Bork and George W. Bush seem to be frozen in time, backward-looking, and fearful philosophical views of government, history, and the Constitution. Strict constructionism, Mr. Speaker, runs contrary to the whole legal development of rights in human history. Strict constructionists look back to the Founders' original document before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and other progressive amendments to the Constitution were added, before non-landowners could vote, before Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Strict constructionists, as former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall said at an event celebrating the 200th anniversary of the writing of the Constitution, quote, believed that the meaning of the Constitution was fixed at the Philadelphia Convention. That would require us to know their original intent and rigidly preserve the Founding Fathers' philosophy, even though they were all men, most were slaveholders, and they allowed slavery in the Constitution. A strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution also means a reaffirmation of states' rights as the preeminent legal guiding principle. A broad interpretation, on the other hand, sees the Constitution as forward-looking, as living, as positive, and a hopeful document. We respect the past and the positive contributions that the Founders made. We seek to understand their intent in the full context in which the Constitution was written. And we seek to understand to the fullest its original meaning. But we also know that it has been changed, and it's been improved along the way. And in order to be more inclusive of all of the American people, therefore, we also know that we have an obligation today to move it even further. The more people are made aware of their rights to which they are entitled, the rights to which they've already been written into national and international law, the more politically educated and conscious people become of these rights. The more politically active and organized the common people become in the struggle to achieve these rights. And the more accessible and responsive our democratic institutions and politics and government become to the democratic will of the people, the faster and more nonviolently we as a society will be able to achieve a new and higher set of human rights. And Mr. Speaker, since this Congress has begun, I've been coming to this floor talking about one issue, and that's high unemployment. In order to wipe out unemployment, which we've been recording from 1890 to 2011, we need a massive jobs program in this country. I recommend a jobs program that benefits all Americans. The rebuilding of 95,000 schools in this nation to an equal high-quality standard, putting roofers, brick masons, electricians, teachers, carpenters to work, providing unprecedented technological access to the Internet and modern forms of communication to 60 million children across our country. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, Tea Party activists and conservatives in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, many of them don't see it that way. But I see something different. I see an America that can build runways for airplanes in states all across this country and build an interstate transportation system by one national federal standard. We simply can't build schools and provide an equal high-quality education for 60 million children in 50 different states, in 15,000 locally controlled school districts, in 3,100 counties, in 19,000 cities across this country, one school at a time. If there's enough money to fight the war in Iraq, if there's enough money, which this Congress keeps writing the check for, to fight the war in Afghanistan, if there's enough money to spend $550 million in 1 week bombing Libya, then, Mr. Speaker, we can find the money in this Congress to rebuild these schools, reduce unemployment, put 15 million unemployed Americans to work, and change the course of our country. If we can put 15 million Americans to work, we can wipe out the nation's debt, its deficit, and provide a long future for the American people. With that said, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield back the balance of my time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy